So welcome everyone to the third in our three-part series, a collaboration between the Mass Teachers Association and the American Institute of Architects, Massachusetts, out of the pandemic, building the public schools our communities deserve. And today, this third, the last session, at least for now, is really, the title is Our State School Building Process, Challenges and Possibilities for Radical Change. We're really going to look at solutions that are right before us and also some of the bigger solutions, possibilities in order to create outstanding, healthy, education-friendly school buildings for every student in Massachusetts. But I would like to first ask Mary Najimy, the president of the MTA. Mary, if you want to say a few words to welcome us on this third session.
I do, and welcome back for session 3. You know, I've been thinking a lot about the conversation that we had in session 1 when we opened up. Our architects talked about the multiple uses of school buildings. We actually call those community schools. The NEA, the National Education Association, has a whole school of thought on community schools, and it's been a vibrant movement probably for 30 years. So one of the things that I think we can continue to think about is, how do we take a project like this? And today we're really talking about how do we move something legislatively? I think we need to think in two parts. How do we use as a union our collective bargaining power and our legislative power? How do we do some education around what a real community school model is? How do we understand the community school models as related to this project? Because the idea of a community school is that we're centering the needs of the community in our work, and schools are being used to meet those needs. Childcare programs, health and dental care, mental health care, community centers. So it has exciting potential and possibility as we're really thinking about building new buildings for new purposes. Community schools are not something that's well known or discussed in Massachusetts, but in United Teachers Los Angeles, as part of their strike, one of their demands was fewer charter schools and more community schools. So I think an exciting idea to continue to bring to the forefront as it relates to this particular work is, what's the connection between the school of thought around community schools and how do we move an entire program to rebuild our buildings and think about this idea of schools as a public good beyond just public education. I think there's real potential.
Thank you, Mary. So I just wanted to say a few words by way of introduction, then I want to turn it over to Dorrie Brooks, who is a principal at Jones Whitson Architects and an AIA Massachusetts board member. So today we're really going to be exploring the ways we fund, how our system works, our school construction project system, but also then explore ways that we can remedy some of the stark inequities that we have within our system. And I really am very pleased to see that there's educators and architects and legislators and also staff from the Mass School Building Authority. That's terrific, and I hope we'll have I know we'll have a good discussion about that. And I want to say something at the very beginning, though, and echoing something Mary said at our first session, which is, while we rightfully trumpet, that Massachusetts is #1 in so many ways in public education, and that is true, we're also #1 in a more dubious list, which is having the greatest inequality between the wealthiest and the poorest district. We have some of the greatest inequity from those who have and those who not. So that is something and that is reflected as well in our school building program as well. We really want to look at how we can continue to improve on that. In other states, it's much worse, but that's not the measure of what we want here. We can say in many ways how we spend more statewide on school buildings than other places, all probably true. we hold ourselves to a higher standard. I know that everyone on here believes that. So I'm going to now really turn it over to Dorrie Brooks, she'll do the heavy lifting, describing the funding process that we have, the process and sources. And then she's going to really lay out some very specific, tangible changes that we could make in the way we do school construction and the process we use in order to achieve greater equity. And then I will pick up at the end, perhaps, looking even beyond to some more radical changes and radical investments that we could make, looking to our own history for examples of that. And I want to note on the slide right now, there you can see that there's links to the recordings of the previous 2 sessions, which I would encourage people both to watch again and also distribute widely to your schools, your communities, your architecture firms, and I'll also put that in the chat as well. Okay, onward. Dorrie, take it away.
Great, thank you, Max. So I will warn you before we start that every afternoon on Thursday afternoons, the nursing home across the street often has entertainment, sometimes a polka band. So if you hear polka music, there's nothing I can do to get rid of it. Just consider it a soundtrack for our conversation. So as Max said, we're going to talk about funding today. This is, in some ways the hardest part of the conversation to have. We're like a family. Talking about money is always difficult. But I think it's really an important thing to get into, even as we're talking at a time when our state faces tremendous budget challenges, because no change to funding for school construction happens quickly. And it certainly takes time to build momentum. And I'm a big believer in the importance of good communication, sharing information. And I have great confidence in our democracy and our ability to make good decisions if people have the information. So it takes courage on all our parts to continue to have conversations and ask difficult questions. So this is in the vein of that process. We're going to start with, of course, the fun part, the part that Erica introduced, the Menti exercise. So as we get going here, we're going to try and do this just to keep everybody awake and see if we can also hear from you at the very beginning. So for those of you who haven't done this, if you use your phone and point at that image, that QWERTY code, you can immediately get into an interactive and start answering a question. And I'm going to switch screens so you can see what happens. And that question there is, who should pay the cost of building healthy schools? And as you all give your answers, hopefully, if you can see my screen should be showing the results. There we go. Now we start seeing answers and see where we feel collectively the cost of school construction should fall. Great, if we're settling in there, that's really interesting already, that it's gonna keep moving around a little bit. And if you're changing your mind watching your friends vote, that's always interesting as well. But I'm gonna write the numbers that I'm seeing down now and get a sense of where we feel. So we thought 27.6% of the cost should go to local government, 43.7% to state government, and 41% to federal government, to the Fed. So that's a good starting point. And now we're going to go to the second question. If I can, there you go. There we go. So this is a word cloud, and you can enter 3 answers to the question, what is the cost of not investing in healthy schools? A more abstract question, admittedly. There we go. Starting to see some answers. There we go. There's a bunch of answers. That starts to get us into the picture. And, to touch on what Mary was talking about, it's obvious from our answers that we're all thinking about the consequences beyond education itself, thinking about the impact on students' well-being, lifetime well-being issues of healthcare. Not to mention, not maintaining schools means that the schools themselves begin to disintegrate, and we have trouble keeping the quality of our buildings going. Uninformed future leaders is a really interesting answer. And then there are those things we spoke about, absenteeism, the individual metrics that we can look at as we're going along. Weak civic life, I think we're all sort of sensing the challenge there. of what happens when information, again, struggles to get to students, performance issues, inequality, mental health problems. So that gives us a picture, a really quick snapshot. Actually, Max, if you can do me a favor along the way there and grab that screenshot so we can actually preserve that as a part of this conversation. That's really helpful. And that'll flip around as we go. I'm going to go ahead and switch back because I want to be sure that we have time to get through all of our content here.
Dorrie, as you're getting your next question ready, I was very struck, and we will have the chance to talk about this in the breakout groups, how it was fairly evenly balanced on the funding side. Looked sort of third that people thought. That was interesting.
Yeah, so that's where we want to kind of step in first, is talking a little bit about to the right screen. Talking about our perception of where the cost of schools should be borne. So this is we wanted to start from a national perspective and look at this a little bit first, because I was kind of really curious to see where we thought it would go. It's, to me, very interesting that 27.6% local is below our average in this state, but more than actually, that happens in many states. I mean, we all share the expectation that there should be some local share. The local share itself across the board around the country is actually 82%. Massachusetts is significantly better in that we actually do contribute at a state level to our schools, to our school construction process. But most striking, of course, is that the federal share across the country is 0.2%. And by all accounts, this group, and it's no surprise, feels pretty strongly that there should be some federal responsibility to paying for schools. And that's a really important thing to note, is that we're actually finding ourselves in a situation where localities and the state government are struggling here between each other. And as taxpayers, we're contributing to both pots of money. So we're all invested in this. But there's an absent player at the table. And maybe that's something to address. I'm not a lawmaker, and we're not talking at that level here, but I think it's really interesting that we feel that tension. But again, I want to point out that Massachusetts actually is amongst the top 10 states for state investment. Admittedly, we also have a lot of older buildings and a high construction cost. So our investment per square foot is inherently a little bit higher already. But we do have a program here that I do want to acknowledge we should be very proud of. It's considered a national model. That said, the program itself struggles to meet the need. So we also, before we get too far, I want to be sure that we acknowledge that when we're talking about health issues in schools, as we were in our last talk, we have to take into consideration that all of Massachusetts students are not in public schools. Most are. But there are school buildings that are outside of that loop. And if we're thinking about issues like environmental quality, I know one group was talking about a baseline set of expectations, a sort of a Bill of Rights in relation to environmental health. That's actually outside of the purview of the statutes that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, because that's a regulatory black hole that we have, where the quality of our school buildings, is inspected at the beginning of a project when it's completed in construction. But there's really a lot of a window there where that's not addressed at all. Is it a public health issue? Is it a regulatory issue? We don't have a clear-cut answer to that. And one of those things that might come out of our time here with COVID is really starting to ask that question. And I kind of hope that there isn't a loss of momentum in critically asking that question about all of our buildings and all students' well-being. That said, we're going to focus on public schools. And I also want to note the number there, 1,859 public school buildings. Not all of them are able to take advantage of the state grant funding available. Some are pre-K, some are co-located in a way that makes them inadmissible. But it's a big number. It's a huge number to think about. I think the number of schools that are actually relevant to the programs the MSBA supports is in the 1,600 and up range, so it's a little bit lesser. So let's talk a little bit about how in Massachusetts we divide that local and state aid and where the money itself is coming from. So at the state level, The revenue that is that's targeted towards school construction is uniquely coming from sales tax. It's 1 penny of sales tax with a cap of 800 million to the grant capability. Now, 800 million is going to surprise the architects. I see some people looking around already. It has been 500 million as a cap until just this last year, and the Opportunities Act kind of brought about a change in that number. That doesn't mean that that much goes out. That's just the possibility. There have to be projects in line. That doesn't always happen right away. And also the sales tax revenue has to be there. And there are times where that could not happen. But that's the capacity of the grant program. It's administered very professionally by the MSBA, Massachusetts School Building Authority. And that funding can go towards core and accelerated repair projects. There have been other projects along the way, but essentially core projects are whole school replacement or renovation projects. And accelerated repair projects tend to be focusing on a particular system. Boiler system, roof system, so more limited and significantly less costly. Other important elements of these program terms are that this is a voluntary eligibility program. And I think that's important to point out because not every district necessarily gets the same proportion of support. They have to opt in and apply to the program to receive access to the grant. And also, I use the word accountable, but I think I want to stress at this point about our process in the state is it was set up to avoid political influence, meaning that it's a very well-structured program, and that's a really good thing. It's hard to get across to districts sometimes that it's not a program that you can lobby to get more money from. That's not the way it should happen, and it's not the way it does happen, and that's an incredibly important aspect of it. On the local side, while localities have other revenue sources, the bulk of the funding that goes towards the local commitment to school construction and capital expenses and repair comes from property taxes. And again, how much each district contributes is variable based on property taxes, and we're going to talk about that. Within that funding that they have available, they also have the responsibility of ongoing maintenance and operations, and generally speaking, it's the locality's responsibility to take care of schools. So the program is, again, a grant program that you can opt into. So the Massachusetts School Building Authority, the enabling legislation was developed in 2004 and really started to have impact in 2008, 2009. So we have considerable track record to look at now. When I reread the legislation, the statutes that are established under Chapter 70B, I was really struck by the very opening paragraphs, given our conversation, that do highlight specifically the interest in, the Commonwealth's interest in promoting positive educational outcomes and ensuring health, safety, security, and well-being of students. So the things that we're talking about are right there, indicated as an obligation and a hope for this program. So it's certainly legitimate that we'd be talking about health and well-being at the same time that we're talking about education. So some of the more specific language within the statutes themselves that are really important to understand are that this is a capped reimbursement rate. So you apply to the program. Each district is determined how much their grant reimbursement will come in at is determined by 3 important factors. This is a very complicated math program that I could not tell you how it works. It's beyond my ability and math skills. But it takes into account poverty rate, community income, and community property wealth. And that determines your eligibility, your reimbursement rate with the grant programs. That reimbursement rate, though, for your district is capped at 80%. No district exceeds 80%, no matter what that calculation determines. And then that is also 80% of eligible costs. And that's a really important thing. I mean, this is not something architects don't probably understand, but it's always important to clarify because districts often seem to not understand this well enough, that not everything is eligible for that reimbursement. We'll talk a little bit more about that. There's also specific statute language that incentivizes certain types of projects. For instance, a renovation can be a more costly project, but it's an important value to renovate old buildings. So there are incentive points available, extra reimbursement points, 2%, added to your reimbursement if you're doing a renovation, though districts that are at the 80% cap don't qualify for those. So the Mass School Building Authority, MSBA, has already accomplished 264 core projects. That's major renovation or new construction projects since roughly 2008, 2009. They average 34 to 51 accelerated repair projects a year. Those are, again, much less expensive projects to complete. There was a past green repair process. That project's kind of largely gone away, and there was a previous science lab project, but don't hear much about that. But as a whole, it's been a really successful program in distributing this grant money, and $4.7 billion has been kind of reimbursed through the MSBA. On the flip side, you know, when we talk about how many schools there are in the state, and we talk about there being, you know, 1,600, greater than 1,600 school buildings eligible that are a part of our state inventory to take care of, it's disconcerting that only 16 schools are welcomed into the core program a year. So at the rate of 16 schools a year, it would take 100 years to replace all of Massachusetts school inventory. And that's a pretty stark fact to know about. From the MSBA's own report that is published every 4 years, the 2016 report noted that 40% of Mass school buildings have to be renovated, have not been renovated in the last 20 years. And we have a lot of old buildings still that are I personally have a fondness for the 19th century buildings and the early 20th century buildings, because I think they in some ways are the most wonderful, but a 100-year-old building needs a complete overhaul to really work as a school. And we have 100 of those. And then we have 270 schools identified that need extensive renovation. So that's a backlog that really needs to be addressed. So I wanted to look at this as well, because when Max and I were reviewing some of these slides, and we were talking about what full funding would look like, so what is full funding going to look like? And I honestly had no idea where we would even start that conversation. But I did find that the National Council of School Facilities had gone through and assessed each state. And in a report that's actually also kind of in association with USGBC, they were saying full funding should look like an investment level of 4% of the replacement value of your entire inventory of schools per year. And that roughly for the state of Massachusetts looks like a program that is 4, maybe 5 times the size of our current program. So that's obviously a really big number, but it gives you a starting point, and I'm sure there are other ways of assessing that, but I thought that was at least an interesting answer to consider. So the problem we have with our situation as a whole, the most pressing problem, is that it just takes a lot to do what we need to do given the scale of facilities that we have. So the program that we have is a great program, but it lacks the resources that it needs to do what its mission is to do completely. The second problem we want to identify here is a problem. The next 2 issues are really things that are just as a result of time, really. So this is an MSBA chart that you can find readily online, and I put the link at the bottom for you. It usually is covered with a lot of information about specific schools, but the point I want to make in drawing to these 2 lines are that that reimbursement rate is set by the MSBA at $333 per square foot currently. When the program began, the reimbursement rate and the construction cost, average construction costs across the state for school construction, were very much the same point. In fact, because we were in recession, the initial reimbursement rate was actually below the construction cost, which was obviously not what anybody had anticipated. But over time, the reimbursement rate has remained flatter than the rise in cost of construction in school construction. And this matters because it indicates that the money available, the grant available, is being spread, has to be spread farther and farther. You know, if you keep these two numbers pegged together, you risk the possibility of just having to reduce increasingly the number of schools that can be constructed. So the per square foot eligibility that we're talking about, so when we say $333, if you're an 80% community, you're getting 80% of $333 per square foot in that grant. Everything above that $333 up to your cost of construction is borne by the locality. And in that way, the local share is more than just the difference between your reimbursement rate and $303 per square foot. It is higher. So your effective rate is different. And that just points to the fact that this has grown, points to the fact that the local share has grown over time. And this is, again, largely due to the rising cost of construction more than anything. So the other thing that's been going on since this program was initiated is just as a statewide level, growing inequality. So we have the challenge throughout Massachusetts of raising property values. And again, remember, local property taxes cover the local share. So the capacity of the community to be a part of a program has a lot to do with whether they have the capacity to pay their share. But also that originating formula that determines your reimbursement rate, to some degree, also includes the data relating to wealth, you know, both property tax wealth, income wealth, and poverty rates. And as those things have changed across the state in the last 10 years, that's something that may affect the reimbursement rate in some way that at least deserves to be looked at. But more importantly, we see the impact of this map. Now, what this map is showing is assessed property values across the state. It's using MassGIS. The dark blue areas and purple areas, purple in particular, is areas where property values are assessed at 2 million or greater. And it scales down to areas in red. You see some dots in red out here, and in some of the gateway communities in particular are assessments of 150,000. So that difference in value, you can really, I just thought Erica had shown a map last time with schools on it. And the concern I had is she was looking actually in her map at district expenditures per student in education. And that actually mischaracterizes this issue, which is how much capacity there is locally to support school construction. Because what you see is, you see this band, particularly North Central and Western Mass, and admittedly, I'm from Western Mass, I should have admitted that from the beginning, where, property values just really struggle. And you see that in a reluctance from districts to even be a part of the program necessarily. So taking that information about how many schools have been constructed and kind of cross-referencing it to municipal property value valuations kind of also produces some interesting information. And I want to be careful in presenting this. So this is, we're looking at which municipalities have had a core project and how many. And then we're dividing the state into 10 groupings of municipality based on their ranked from lowest to highest equalized property values. And what this is indicating really is just trying to indicate a little bit how much harder it is for communities that are clustering, that have lower property values, to even contribute to their share. So it's like an iceberg. We see the projects, we know that some projects fail for overrides, and there's a lot of economic and political reasons for that. But we also know that there are probably a lot of communities that aren't even doing green repair projects and are entering the core program because they don't have the capacity. Whereas it isn't that difficult for a community with a high property value to assess and pull the local means to support a project. And you kind of see that in where these projects can go. So that's something I think that we hope can be addressed. And this I just found interesting in doing this. I noticed in assessing it that the lowest ranking 140 communities by municipal assessed property values equal in assessment, Cambridge alone, you know. So geographically, you're really talking about this area. Now, admittedly, there's a lot more people in Cambridge per square foot than there are in all these other communities, but it takes a lot of geography to map to that. And that's a real challenge because you obviously can't do that as a school system. So you have students busing, you have regionalized schools trying to aggregate enough resource capacity to support schools. And that's somewhat similar to the issue that we have in education separate from buildings. So another area, sort of diving past the statutes to the specifics of the guidelines that the MSBA has latitude over specifically, are the things that Pip and Laura talked about. That again, that reimbursement rate is for eligible costs, and appropriately so. The MSBA ties that eligibility to educational space. You know, the state's investment is in supporting the creation of educational space. There are things that are relevant to specifically urban and low-income communities that are not necessarily specifically the educational space, but that are very critical, that really can make the difference in the success of that school as a community school. Things like green space, things like, you know, acoustic treatment to separate from the street, addressing brownfield soils. Site costs is I'm constantly reminded by the landscape architects we work with that the cap on site costs is a real challenge in some environments. So those issues are also outside of the reimbursement rate, and that then those things that you cannot do away with become again part of the local share and add to the local project cost. So this takes us kind of to the big picture. I tried to present that from the big picture of how do we fund it and how much do we need, down to the specifics of things that the legislature could be looking into, but also talking about MSBA specific guidelines. But really, there's also the question of district priorities and the role we play as individuals in advocating for district priorities and kind of having the courage to speak up on issues of buildings and facilities. And it's difficult because obviously for many districts, these things can become in tension with other override issues that come up. You know, often that's the challenge for many communities, that you don't necessarily want to draw attention to your schools if you're also trying to fund your teachers, if you're also trying to fund you know, municipal workers. So that tension is really more evidently felt in lower income communities particularly. But I think it's on us all to continue to ask those questions. So getting into some recommendations of things that we can address here, and I don't have the answers, but what we spoke about that I wanted to bring up again, because it's been mentioned by several breakout groups, is the idea of establishing a baseline right to healthy learning environment for all children. So again, this is not necessarily something relating to Chapter 70B. It's a little bit more specifically something that we might be talking about more broadly as a state and trying to figure out from a regulatory standpoint where that can happen. You know, is this something for the building code to address? Is it something that DESE can look into? Is there a way that we can kind of raise this obligation to a higher level so that it's not something that, because honestly, as we're all finding, and I think many architects and engineers on the call are finding that their districts are looking at the data on environmental quality in their schools for probably the first time in many, many years and seeing the discrepancy in their own district. And it's a problem they don't know how to handle. So it's easy to sweep problems like environmental air quality, indoor air quality, operating HVAC systems, you know, similar to asbestos issues like that. You know, you just kind of sweep them under the rug as long as you can. Well, we've dealt with other issues, and perhaps we can deal with this question. Then there's the option of fully funding the MSBA grant program to really meet the goals that we have. That's a huge question. I'm not sure how to get there. I think Max has some ideas, so I'll leave it to him to float through some specific ideas. And then within the statutes that exist, revisiting them to be sure that they're operating as intended, and to be sure that there isn't anything that can be done to address what we see and know are growing inequities in Massachusetts that Max has been mentioning. Are there ways we can address the incentive points to specifically support minority and low-income communities in the same way that we specifically support the idea of renovation or green schools? Is there a way to adjust that cap, or at least be sure that communities are getting closer to that cap? And then prioritizing indoor environmental quality and assessing statements of interest. I think this is something the MSB is already talking about doing. That what schools are invited in, obviously you're worried about structural issues, but there are other criteria that are assessed, and maybe the ranking and weighting of environmental quality could be raised in that set of weighted criteria. And then can we revise the per square foot cost eligibility guidelines to specifically acknowledge the higher burden of responsibility for health concerns in urban and low-income communities? That's tricky. I see how that's tricky, because as you change those guidelines, you want to change them fairly and evenly across the board. But nonetheless, acknowledging that our schools are doing more than just providing teaching spaces is really important. I just doubt that we were fully thinking about this as clearly as we could today when the statutes were written. So I think that that's an interesting idea. And some of that is really kind of separate from any legislative possibilities. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton to Max, who I think is notorious for thinking big, and I'm sure can come at this with some other ideas as well.
Thanks, Dorrie. That was fantastic. And those were a lot of actually very big thoughts. I'm muted. Can you hear me? Can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Matt.
Yes.
All right, good.
Okay.
Thank you. Dorrie, that was fantastic. And those were not at all small thoughts. So there were a lot of really important proposed remedies that could really make a huge difference. I just want to step a little further back. And, those of you know, I teach at UMass in the architecture department. I teach urban and architectural history. And one of the things that has fascinated me, obsessed me, you could say, is drawing on our own national and state history when we think about how to solve really big problems. And so I just want to point to, at this moment, when often the notion is, oh my goodness, we are in the midst of a terrible crisis, which we are, health crisis, economic crisis. It's almost like let's pull inward and we have to constrict ourselves. In fact, I have a whole history in the New Deal era, the Great Depression, of quite the opposite. And so I'm showing you here national projects, the Hoover Dam, or public housing complexes. 10 million people were employed in various projects of the Works Progress Administration, which was one of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal key institutions. Over the course of the Great Depression, 10 million people were put to work, many of them in projects such as this, major construction projects, renovation projects, school buildings, infrastructure, sewage, transportation, all an enormous range. You can go to the next one, Dorrie. I like to highlight that at my own university, UMass Amherst, in the very beginning, midst of the Great Depression, which really, cratered in 1932-33, they immediately dove into university buildings as well. The Goodell Library at UMass Amherst, which is still in use. Right, you can go to the next one. And of course, they're all across Massachusetts. Among the many things that were built, the parks and the bridges and the canals in Holyoke that were renovated, there were also over 100 school projects, some brand new schools, some major renovations. These are just two examples. The old high school in Northborough, I think it's used as a town hall now, and Nathaniel Morton School in Plymouth from 1937. Again, major construction projects undertaken in the worst economic crisis of the time. And in fact, it's no accident. That was the design of it. Dorrie and I were joking earlier. She said, wow, you're some Marxist, which is probably true. But I'm also just a New Deal Democrat in a way, because these are projects that were undertaken throughout the Commonwealth and throughout the country, both to produce renovations to important institutions, like our schools, of course, but also to put people back to work exactly at a moment when there was a grave economic crisis. Maybe just go to the next one. And just more recently, again, this is not a public school building, but this is a public university building. That's where my office used to be, the Fine Arts Center. Actually, it's taken from my new office, the new architecture building. I only like to show this because even up through the 60s and 70s, we were taking under major building projects of an epic scale. This was the largest arts complex built west of Boston from 1968 to 1974. It was at the heart of the campus, really is the gateway to the campus. And that kind of brings me back for a second to something Dorrie, I think, beautifully raised, which is she went back to look at the enabling law for the Mass School Building Authority and noted it doesn't say create buildings so that students will have high MCAS scores. Of course, right? It says in order to create for healthy, educationally sound, and to pursue or encourage the well-being of our students. So there's a broad range of goals we had. Similarly, what you're seeing in front of you this is not about vocational education for just getting students jobs. This was deciding to build this massive arts complex for working class kids right at the heart of the campus. In other words, even as we're talking and discussing this and thinking about the details of a funding formula, we have to continually ask, what are we funding for? And it's going back to what Mary said, are we building schools that simply hold a certain number of seats and a certain number of educators? Or are we building community schools that become the central institutions to house a variety of needs, and not only inside their walls, but also in the environment around them? So, and then the last slide is a non-picturesque slide, but a very, very important one. I want to emphasize this because often we walk into these conversations, not just in the pandemic, but even before this, and we say, and rightly, as Dorrie said, like, how are we going to tackle this? I think, Dorrie, you said something like we spent about $800 million once SOA Student Opportunity Act is fully implemented. $800 million a year. We should probably spend 4 or 5 times that, $4 billion, let's say, per year, to really get turn the corner on this problem. Remember, you said we do about 16 core projects a year, even though we have 270 that have extensive needs for renovation. So, and people always approach this as, well, how are we going to get that money? We limited ourselves over the past quarter century by tax cuts across for individuals to the tune of that we have taken out billions of dollars out of our annual budget through tax cuts. And I just throw this up there. This is a list of the 19 billionaires in Massachusetts. We have some of the greatest concentration of billionaires in the country, and those billionaires saw their wealth grow by $17 billion just in those first months of the pandemic. You can see that is March, when we middle of March is sort of when we close schools down, to the middle of June. 3 months, $17 billion increase. Now, the reason I put this up there very graphically, you can see the names, is that we have the money to do this. So that should not be the problem. And I think part of the session, these 3 sessions, was to talk about the details, and we're about to go into breakouts to talk about the details of the formula, the process, the funding mechanisms. But I hope we are also willing to say, what do we really need quickly? Because we don't need to think that we don't have the money, because this remains a very, very wealthy state. It's just a matter of getting it. So part of our job is, I think, to discuss what the true need is there. And Dorrie laid out brilliantly the number of schools that are in need of repair, number of schools, districts that cannot afford to take this on, and really then think about how we make that demand of those who have the capacity to raise the money in order to create a great school for every single student. There are other places where it may be harder. to say, yes, we have that capacity easily to raise the money. That's not the case in Massachusetts. We can absolutely do this. So what I think we should do right now is go into these breakout sessions to have a conversation. I think, yeah, we have enough time here. And these are the 3 questions. And we have breakout leaders, those people like Pip Lewis and Larry Spang. Look in your private chat because I've sent you a link there. You're going to be the leaders there. And I am actually going to lead breakout group 1. It'll just take me a couple minutes to get there once I open these up. So we'll do this, I think, for 25 minutes. And then Dorrie's going to be sort of watching the questions and as they're being posted on the Google Doc that you'll be writing on. And then we'll come out of that and she'll kind of offer a few thoughts towards the end about what she sees there and try to respond to some of the queries. Sound good? All right. So when I click this, everyone's going to be sent off into their breakout rooms, and there should be a breakout room leader in each, and who will be able to kind of record the comments and questions that people raise in there. But let's be sure not to skip that last one, because we can talk about all the legal and policy changes that we want, and they're crucial, don't get me wrong, but we also have to think about how we build together as communities, educators, architects, build a kind of a movement that can make this happen. All right, great. I'm going to send you off into your breakout rooms now. See you in a minute. So thanks, everyone. I hope you had a good discussion. We certainly did in our group. Dorrie, I don't know if you had a chance. We left you out so that you could kind of peruse all the notes people were taking. If there are a few things either to answer or a few comments you wanted to lift up, this is the moment.
I'll do my best to talk about some of the questions that I heard and saw in the chat and in the lists. If you can also help me out on some of the big picture thinking at the end, because there was a little bit of both going on. So you look ahead at the last section. I saw some questions people have. I don't think I can answer all of them. I want to throw them out there so that maybe we can get some answers down the road. How does the current system compare to what happened before in terms of funding? Where did the money come from under the SBA as opposed to the MSBA? And how is it structured? There are questions about that. A lot of people were curious about the specific MSBA calculations on payments. I tried to get into it. If you're confused, you can imagine how community members are often confused too. It's a very thorough and fair process, and that's kind of why I say the architects on this call who do work with the MSBA are really well versed at understanding the guidelines and spend a lot of time understanding those guidelines to try and bring projects in as efficiently for the communities as possible. I saw a lot of questions about the cost of construction and how we could bring that down. And I was in one group specifically that talked a lot about that. And people do have questions about that. And those are super legitimate questions. Like, why is the cost of construction higher than it is for charter schools and private schools? And I won't thoroughly answer it, but I'll share some of what I know to be the case. The MSBA actually did a really useful roundtable about this a while back, because it was a noticeable concern that some of the same architects were working on charter schools and MSBA schools with different end results. So understanding why that might be is really important. And some of the reasoning that was that we all kind of saw there, I think, from our experiences collectively, are that charter schools are not working to a long-term expectation of their buildings. A charter is a 6-year charter. So they're not as committed to that building long-term. So they don't have the same expectations for quality of finishes and durability. So that's a major factor. There's a lot less expectation for systems. You know, MSBA is trying to be sure that you have quality security systems, and they require that the consulting team be very broad and very capable of addressing a lot of issues. Charter schools have the ability to pick and choose how much they're going for and how much they hold off in a different direction of the project. As Max, or as somebody in my group pointed out, I think John, public schools are always prevailing wage. There are private projects that are not prevailing wage, and that increases the cost of a project. And we should celebrate that we're supporting union work. That's a good thing. I think this call would agree. And then there's just the factor of time and how long an MSBA project kind of takes, because it's a public process. It involves the whole community. Everybody's involved in that process. The level of scrutiny as a part of being public construction, and the obligation to listen to the community and engage the community and do it thoroughly, and be sure it's vetted, does extend the length of time and the complexity of projects. So those are some of the reasons. Other questions that came up, well, actually, there were some ideas in our group about, whether or not there are ways using the power of such broad purchasing, essentially, and construction, whether there are ways to find savings in that by aggregating in some way or systematizing elements of the construction, and maybe looking back to sort of models like the model school program, but looking back to other eras in which certain things were more repeatable and more consistent. That was an idea some folks had and some questions people had. And then I think there were a lot of comments about revenue streams and a lot of interest in seeing, looking at capital gains taxes and corporate taxes further to see if there are ways to do it differently, looking to other countries to see if there are other ways of doing things that I think a lot of people are really curious about, and a strong desire to see equity addressed. I think it was an interesting conversation in different groups about how legislation can intentionally acknowledge a need for equity, and that tension between doing the same thing everywhere and sometimes applying the same rules everywhere is an inequitable solution. So how do we, kind of change that language potentially? And I think that's a very interesting challenge. Max, did you see some suggestions for the future?
Yeah, so I'll just highlight a few, and by the way, as a reminder, I put the link for the previous sessions in the chat, and that same link will work once we get this recording up, probably by Monday. We'll have all three up, and I encourage you all to send it out more widely. A few things that I noticed in there, lots of discussion that, in fact, the Fair Share Amendment and other conversations about taxes can actually help build the movement. Because if you want to tax the wealthy, then you are then saying what for? What are the good uses that we have? It was interesting. I noticed several people really grabbing onto the idea of community schools, and not only is that good because it strengthens the schools. If, let's say, you provide health clinics or really good athletic facilities or libraries that are open to the public and the like. But it also broadens the kind of constituency that's invested in high quality schools. That was an interesting note that several people made. And then I guess I'll just, use the privilege of being able to pick out there, emphasize something I emphasized in there that we talked about is there is the system, intended or not, but the way our system is set up, because it still relies so much on local property taxes, that there is a sense, and I think we all probably experience it, that in, let's say, Concord, where Mary, you teach, or in Weston or elsewhere, that you'll end up seeing the fanciest, the nicest schools, the greenest schools. And I was relating how I spent a semester in Medellin, Colombia, and was so impressed how that community had decided to, as a way to kind of get through, repair some of the damage of the violence of the 1980s, 1990s, by building beautiful public libraries, bringing best architects they could find to come in and build beautiful public libraries, and they only went in the poorest districts. The rich districts did not get a public library. And we tend to think, well, of course, if you're in a wealthier community, you're going to get a nicer, a better school. And I think there's a way in which we could think about flipping that around. That actually the people who are most in need of benefiting from the greenest, the most beautiful schools, the ones that have all the other kinds of functions in them, are actually people that who don't have access to that kind of money. So that I want to have people think about that as we think about the various very specific and larger kind of changes that we would want to make a good system that much better. And I do want to emphasize that that compared to many other states, we do far more and far better than many states. In fact, one of our participants in my group noted that, you know, the Massachusetts schools tend to be better built, better designed than other places. And maybe they cost more because of that. And let's not forget that. Final note I'll make is that one thing that everyone was agreed upon was that we need more money to be spent on these schools, that there's so much need out there, and that we need to, even as we revise our formulas, revise our policies, we simply, if this pandemic has proved anything, is that the crisis is that much more important to create healthy schools. So folks, it is about to be 5:30, and I really want to thank everyone for having participated today in the previous two sections, and I think I know the answer to this question. Does it make sense to continue some kind of conversations to advance this discussion further? Kind of give me a thumbs up if you think there might be a value in having further discussions. Okay, that's great, because I think these have been invaluable. I think we'll get together, MTA, AIA, we'll get together and talk about what's the next stage, what's the next set of discussions that could be really useful. And again, I want to thank the NEA folks for being here and doing really good listening, and listening into what both educators and architects have to say. So with that, thank you all. It's been really great, and we will absolutely be in touch soon.
Thank you, Max. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dorrie.